Today, the title of the webinar is Leading in a Global World. The webinar will share how community vitality educators in Minnesota and South Dakota came together with community partners to deepen our understanding of assets, skills, and resources necessary to co-create meaningful extension programming related to equity and inclusion in communities. And our presenters are Holli from University of Minnesota Extension, Kari O'Neill, also from South Dakota State University Extension, along with Sherin, also from South Dakota, and then Tobias Spanier from the University of Minnesota. So with that introduction for the participants, you can use your chat to ask any questions or provide any comments, and I'll turn it over to the group for their presentation. Thanks everyone for being here this morning.
Thank you, Mark. This is Kari O'Neill, and I'm going to start the webinar this morning. We're really glad to have you all participating with us. We would like to keep this really informal, so please chat in your questions and we'll try to answer those as we go along. But I'm going to start our grant process, or our grant proposal was called Leading Change in a Global World, and a little bit of background about what brought us to this grant proposal. Actually, University of Minnesota Extension and SDSU Extension had applied for another grant before this one, excuse me, and we didn't get that grant. It was about change and putting together a new leadership kind of program. So what we looked at after we didn't get that grant was why didn't it work, and what did we need to learn before we could apply for a similar grant to really work on inclusion and equity in the future. What we decided is we needed to learn more about some of the newer populations that we were seeing settling in our states, and how we could learn about their leadership programs and learn about what Extension could do to possibly assist them as they went through leadership and change as they settled in our states, or as they really worked their way up into leadership positions. So I'll talk a little bit about our purpose. The purpose of the grant was really, again, to understand leadership needs in immigrant and underserved communities. We often study those types of communities for other reasons, but we really felt that we needed to learn more about their leadership. What were their structures that they're used to? How did they get communities to engage in leadership? And what kinds of training did they use currently, or did they feel that they needed for their new leaders? So we were going to also explore the framework that we could put together that might help us work with and in those immigrant and underserved communities. Finally, we wanted to build connections and share resources, what Extension does best, across communities and states, so that we could impact other communities that we weren't necessarily working directly with, but that might have similar needs. So we put together a list of structured activities that we could do kind of to get to the point that we wanted to really understand leadership in the communities that we were working with. We first of all decided that we would each identify a community partner, and we wanted those partners to be different so that we were studying different populations, but yet probably looking at similar populations across our states also. We wanted to start by hosting a cross-state summit so that we could really build relationships and explore some possibilities, and we did that last January. Then we wanted, in between the first summit and the final summit, to work inside our states to figure out more of the in-state needs and how we could help with community work that was going on. And we decided we would come back together in September kind of to share the reflections that we had learned throughout that 6 months, and then also to plan for some next steps, what would be happening in the future. And probably the biggest thing that we hoped would come out of the study that we were doing is to create a resource list that could capture our new partnerships, what some key curricula needs were, and then what some potential funders might be, because as we went forth with the communities that we were working with, we also wanted to help them to grow stronger and to learn to meet their needs through maybe some grant processes or learning who the sponsors might be in their communities and that sort of thing. So when we started, we decided to ask ourselves first who might want to work with us. Sometimes in extension, we throw things out and we hope we get responses, but we really did a lot of research, I think, on who would make good partners for us because they were looking for and needed some help with leadership. And then we also looked at what can we do well, so that we were going in with some of our own resources, but also asking them what resources they already had and how we could maybe mesh those things. What relationships had already been started. Both in Minnesota and South Dakota, we had some partnerships going already with the communities that we decided to use or to work with. I shouldn't say use. And how do we make this partnership sustainable so that beyond this grant, we could work together on other needs that they might have or that we might have. What were our expectations of our partnering communities? They had to be willing to work with us. They had to have a desire to really strengthen their communities now and into the future. They were looking for leadership and looking for new ways to do things. And maybe in South Dakota particularly looking for some new funding avenues. They wanted to create an open and trusting environment to learn from each other. So we didn't want people to come in just individually or looking for their own particular needs, but coming in and really wanting to work together to build a team, to go back to their communities and work on leadership together. We wanted a committed team for the project, but we also wanted to keep that door open in the community so that they could invite others into the effort as we made progress. So hopefully that team would keep growing. And then we also needed their commitment from them to attend 2 in-person summits with us, which for some of us that doesn't sound very hard, but when you're working shift work like most of the members in our communities were doing, sometimes that's really hard to get away and make time to be that leader that goes out of the community, gets information, and brings that back home. So in South Dakota, we chose the Karen population to work with. Our Karen population mostly lives in the city of Huron and works for a turkey meat processing plant there. When they came into Huron, they were from Burma or Myanmar, and they were being very heavily persecuted. So they were very happy to be settled into Huron, and I think that is one thing that really attracted us to work with that population is they were so glad to be here and they so wanted to create their own little community, but to be a part of Huron as well. So when we chose the Karen population, we could really see an increase in that population in our state. We realized that our need to serve them was great because they were asking for some resources and kind of looking for some help with leadership. One of their really big goals was to build a Karen association. And so we felt that that was a really good match for the skills that we have in community vitality and extension and what they wanted in a Karen association. And then we also, as we chose the Karen population, Minnesota also has a Karen population, but they decided to work with another population so that we could kind of learn from 2 different populations that live in both of our states. The thing that I think really attracted us to Huron also was that it wasn't just the Karen population that wanted to work on these issues. It was also some people that were already established in Huron, their city finance officer, a health worker that had been really advocating a lot for the Karen population. So we felt like we had some makings of a really good team in that community. And we also felt like in South Dakota, working with one community where the population was very centered would be a good start for us. So I guess that's kind of why we started with the Karen population.
Great. This is Holli Arp, and I'm the program leader with our Leadership and Civic Engagement team in Minnesota, and had the pleasure of working on this grant. In Minnesota, when we were recruiting partners, we chose to work with our Latino and Latino population. The map on this slide shows you the demographics of the state of Minnesota, and the star indicates the area in which we did most of our work in partnership this year. Similar to South Dakota, when comparing our state demographics to the demographics of our current leadership and civic engagement participants, we knew we needed to carve out some time to think about how we engage new and underserved populations differently. In Minnesota, the groundwork for this was actually laid in 2015, where Toby, at the time, saw an opportunity to bring together statewide Latino serving agencies and organizations for a summit. And at that time, over 60 people attended and wanted to continue meeting. And so they ended up expanding their focus and emerging into a multicultural network that still meets on a monthly basis today. And Toby remains connected to this group. And so when we thought about where we go to ask who might want to work with us, this group seems like a natural entry point. And Toby was able to have those conversations. I will turn it over to Toby for you to talk about sort of the three people who expressed the interest and we got to know pretty well.
Thank you, Holly, and good morning, everyone. I am Toby Spanier, and I am an extension educator who works primarily in that part of the state that you see outlined here where the star is to the west as well. And I'm one of the educators in the Leadership and Civic Engagement program area at the University of Minnesota Extension. And as Holly mentioned, we had a Latino summit. That group has continued to meet as a multicultural network monthly. And when I met with that group on one of the meetings, I expressed interest in greater collaboration with potential partners. And 3 entities came forward. And one of the ways we strategized around the critical partners was, which partners had the cultural and social capital to really help us move forward with our planning and our investigation as part of this grant process. 3 partners that really had strong connections with other Latino serving organizations and communities and had the cultural capital to allow them to have the language and the knowledge to be able to kind of integrate and do work. Maybe they already had been doing work that was critically important for Latino issues in their communities. And so we were able to identify them as well as their own interest in this program, and that began the relationship that we had with these 3 entities and individuals as part of those entities. I'll let you continue from here.
Okay. The 3 partners that we ended up working with, specific names were DAKOTA'S, who was the diversity coordinator in the Mankato region, Julio Zelaya, who is works for the ACLU but has strong connections in the St. James area, and Jose Williams, who both does consulting and throughout this process ended up working for the Region 9 Development Commission. So, as we started this work, we had some things that we had planned and a lot of things that were unplanned that evolved naturally to benefit this project along the way. So as Kari mentioned, we had some key components of the structured activities that we felt would be really important to this work. And the first was a summit to build relationships. When we began planning the first summit, we saw the need to come together for some trust building, and we knew we had a need to co-create our programming, and we also wanted to keep this time flexible in order to allow the wisdom in the room to emerge. So we started the day by sharing some more about ourselves through an object that was important to us and some information from a cultural self-study that was shared with another programming effort. And then we moved into an activity that many of you may have experienced before that has each person rank where they individually and their culture falls on a continuum of things like individualism versus collectivism and equality versus hierarchy, direct communication and indirect. So it really allowed us to deepen our conversation both about who we were as individuals and where we felt our cultural preferences were. These activities opened us up to be able to talk more in the afternoon and the next morning about various cultural views of leadership and jumpstart some conversations about the assumptions and barriers that sometimes we have in our current operations about leadership education that might limit how we were able to engage in the past. And for Minnesota, day 2 ended up being pivotal as Julio had expressed the need for a parallel approach to working in community. And I would say that for Minnesota, this was one of our aha moments because we had talked about the need to choose a community where we could both work with the white community to think about how they engage new populations differently and how they really truly welcome and engage people in new and different ways, and providing those tools and skills and leadership opportunities to our new populations in the same way that we would provide them and co-create with them what their needs are as we have with our traditional audiences in the past. Anything else that South Dakota might want to?
I would just say too that maybe one of the differences between Minnesota's partnerships and South Dakota's partnerships is South Dakota's partnerships were very grassroots. We had the Karen population that got involved for us. Their job was working at Dakota Provisions turkey plant. They were doing this work on a volunteer basis. So that was a little bit different, but it was really unique in that first summit, the key leader, the key volunteer leader in the Karen population was unable to come. She had gone back to Burma to visit family and be with family at that time, but we had 2 new young men who joined us for that summit. So I think it was really good because in a way it helped expand that team a little bit. Lau, who was the key leader in the Karen community, was at the second summit, and she brought back the young man, one of the young men. But it did help, I think, to take some of that burden almost off of Lau because she's feeling really responsible for leadership in the Karen community. So I think this first summit helped to kind of spread that volunteer spirit of leadership around a little bit, and I think it was good. Some of the activities were great that we did in those couple of days, but as with a lot of meetings and conferences, one of the key parts that I remember and that I think helped build relationships was that networking that we did at break times and at supper that evening, and just in the informal leadership learning that we got to do.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kari. You know, and as we kind of built on the concept that Julio had brought forward, he also had connections with 2 key groups in the St. James area. One group, La Convivencia, that was a group started by a group of Latino women and has evolved to include men as well. And one group called Uniting Cultures that was a lot of the La Convivencia group as well as some of the white allies and communities that really wanted to create a more welcoming place. And so while we had 3 different partners join us and willing to engage, and when Minnesota came we didn't know exactly how that would emerge, all 3 of our partners were interested and willing to engage with us in this project around St. James. So I think another thing that it was key for us is that a lot of the planning after the first summit, the learning and co-creating with community was the core of the year, really. And so we held monthly in-state meetings via technology, and it really helped deepen the relationship and context. For us, it gave us a chance to touch base about what was happening in the St. James community, who had been in the community, what kinds of activities were going on, what kinds of leadership education might be beneficial. it was interesting to schedule the calls as well. We always had a broad agenda for updates. We tried not to make it too specific, and I'll have to admit that that was uncomfortable at times, and yet these meetings evolved very naturally based on who was on the call, what current events were interacting with the work that we were doing, and allowing people to just share what that meant, and it just led to some really deep and meaningful conversations about the current context that our community leaders were living in. We also held monthly meetings across states with Minnesota and South Dakota, which gave us a chance to reflect on this work and some of the similarities and differences in working with an ethnic group that was very new to the country, like the South Dakota Karen population, versus a group who had been established in community for quite some time. And you'll hear us talk about that being one of our key learnings as we go into the rest of the presentation as well. And this time also allowed for those in-person meetings. So the opportunity to deepen our relationships and connections, not only with the partners that were attending the summits, but to broaden our connections within community and those entry points for community leadership. And then the wrap-up for the activities was really the second summit, which was held in September, a chance for us to check our progress, reflect on the progress we had made, and think about some of the next steps. And through that, we really thought it would be important to reflect on those key values and practices, and we'll move into some of those values and practices that emerged in our conversation and were reinforced throughout our work as well. So I think some of the keys here are taking time to understand the cultural norms of the audience, and I would add, while at the same time being vulnerable and transparent about what we don't know, that authenticity about entering these conversations was really important. While we knew that this work was not just about translating curriculum, and we knew we needed to do our work differently, I'm not sure we all came in knowing all of the different ways we might need to deconstruct and repackage some of the curricula and resources that we have to share with communities. And for Minnesota, this happened at a time that we as a leadership and civic engagement team were talking about a statewide diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. And that really allowed us to create some new program pathways within our statewide that allows us to provide space to do this work differently. I was also impressed with the level of commitment that our Minnesota partners had to providing feedback on our curriculum in both formal and informal ways. They were really quick to respond to our requests, whether that was sitting in on a webinar, listening to a webinar with some new curriculum that we had coming out, and their willingness to share ideas and improve upon what we were offering and discussing on those monthly calls and in conversations in community. And as we mentioned earlier, there were some differences between the Karen community in South Dakota and the Latinx population in Minnesota that allowed a different level of focus on the leadership training. So one of the things that we discussed in as a difference is that youth development seemed to be core for the Karen population. And some of us had remembered and recalled that when the Karen and even the Latino populations were newer to some of our communities, that their focus and maybe some extension entry points tended to be more in youth or family development than it necessarily was leadership development. And so we had an opportunity to kind of unpack that a little bit and really experienced how some of the Latino population in Minnesota was really ready and asking for leadership in a different way than we had experienced before. Mark, your question, did we encounter any language barriers? Yes, and I'll name for me, the La Convivencia is a group that holds all of their meetings in Spanish. So Toby had definitely a benefit working with that population because he speaks Spanish. I can understand a few words here and there, but when we went to those meetings, there was definitely, some translation that needed to take place, which slows some meetings down. One of the things that we were really learning when we met with La Convivencia and Uniting Cultures is they had really started out offering really intentional translation and services and interpretation, and they were starting to maybe move away from having that dedicated person there, and some people in the group were actually trying to move them back to making sure that they keep that intentionality around the group so that we don't necessarily slide into that traditional mode of we need to move so fast that we don't care for the things that need to be cared for in order for us to do this work well. And Kari, I see you have responded in writing as well. Anything else from South Dakota that you want to add?
I'll add a little bit about the language barrier. When I attended the meetings in Huron with the group, everything had to be translated on the fly. So it was a very long, laborious process. La, the key contact there, she kept saying about it takes so many more words in the Korean language to explain something that's fairly straightforward and short in the English. So the translation was definitely a barrier, especially when I met, and like what Holly said, when she met with the group separate, the summits, when we all came together from across the states, that wasn't so bad. But when we met with the group itself, that was a different situation.
Thanks, Kenny. So a few of the significant learnings that we want to highlight is that, core to this, I think, is that the grant really provided the planned for time, space, and accountability for us to do this work that we knew we wanted to do. And I would say really propelled our work forward in ways that allowed us to carve out even more time and space. And so I do really give credit to this initial effort for how some of our other opportunities have emerged in Minnesota as well. We talk a lot about building intentional relationships, and we tried to unpack that a little bit because sometimes we don't maybe spend enough time thinking about what that means and what it takes to remove the barriers or what it really involves for us to spend our time. So a few of the things for us were stepping outside of your comfort zone, just knowing that walking into a meeting where it's held in a different language and you don't know that language isn't the most comfortable, and that's what others are facing every day. And the recognition of the community wisdom in the room. There are people in the La Convivencia work that were community organizers in El Salvador that really have many leadership lessons to offer us, and recognition of different leadership styles, and practices, and being open to incorporating those in new ways, and recognizing, I would say even more so, recognizing the value that they bring. Taking the time to show up and be a part of community meetings, asking questions of the group, really kind of integrating ourselves into that space, an openness to think about that work differently, letting go of even the concept of a workshop as a couple of hours of education or a cohort program as we're thinking about it. We were trying to suspend how we usually think about what that education might look like to determine, what might be most beneficial to the groups that we were working with. And then the trust building that happens with the follow-up and the follow-through are the key things that we saw in some of that relationship building. We also really tried to put the principle into practice, nothing about us without us in this grant. And again, the grant allowed us the time and space to do that. By including our community partners in that initial planning at that initial summit, spending the time on a monthly basis just reflecting upon our work as well as doing the work in community, I really think it allowed us to do that in a different way than we have sometimes had the opportunity to do. And then it also then helped us even deepen our understanding of some of the cultural practices that are happening. A couple of other things that we should know well, but it's worth remembering, is that sharing across state lines is beneficial to all of us. You know, as Kari mentioned, we are putting together a resource list. There are Minnesota partners, there are South Dakota partners, and we all have access to those additional resources. One thing that I think we haven't highlighted yet is that beyond our work in Minnesota and South Dakota, throughout this work, we've initiated some communication and leveraged some resources and are building relationships with another 10 to 15 different organizations within each of our states. And so I think that's a benefit that sometimes is underutilized as well if we don't take the time to really see who else is doing similar work with us. And then we just feel it is really critical, and thanks to NCRCRD for providing some seed grant funding to allow time for this relationship building and the momentum that it creates for our initiatives. We definitely had some things emerge, as I mentioned, along with the grant, such as a racial equity learning community that Toby's going to talk a little bit more about, that happened in conjunction that really, again, helped propel some of this work forward. I think the timing for us in Minnesota was really great, that we were also contemplating our statewide diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, and what could we learn from this grant that would allow us to put better things in place on a statewide basis. And then I think, you know, the reality that doing this work helps us to be, and helps communities to be positioned well to write grants on their own as well. So I know that the racial equity learning community has already written a number of grants. Toby actually just said this morning that they're including extension in lots of new ways in some of the work that they are doing. And other communities are positioned well to write a Bush Foundation Community Innovation Grant. And we might not be the lead on that, and yet there's definitely an opportunity for us to be a part of it based on some of the relationship building and the work that we've done with our community partners. And Toby or Kenny, I'll turn it to you to talk about outcomes.
Thank you. Thank you, Holly. I'll start, Kenny, and then I'll turn it over to you. But in Minnesota, Holly mentioned that timing is everything, I think, and for us in Minnesota, it just seemed like the timing was perfect. What was interesting is that all three of the collaborative partners on this particular grant that worked with us, those community partners, have been critical in ongoing partnership in other work that has also now happened in Minnesota, which is really exciting for us. And we're starting to see some additional ripples from that, where we're not maybe the lead on other grants, but extension is being written into those grants because we have formed a relationship, and they have also now had some experience with some of the programming that can be beneficial for meeting their community needs. But one of the projects has been the rural equity learning communities that have taken place in southern Minnesota, basically with Region 9 Development Commission, focused on building greater inclusion and equity and diversity in communities as a way to really help promote entrepreneurship and economic growth. The Greater Mankato Diversity Council has been a significant partner in that, and Bukata Hayes is the executive director of that council. And he and I have built a relationship now, and he has been was part of our grant as well with NCRCD. And he also now recognizes all the work, all the different ways that Extension can provide a resource and an asset to a project that he works on and a community that he works with. And so that's been pretty significant to see that the ripples of the rural equity learning community, not only through the communities that were involved in that, but now as it spreads out and starts to take on greater hold in additional communities in southern Minnesota. My City Academy is an effort, Holly mentioned, the statewide leadership and civic engagement programming that we have tried to do to have a statewide impact on diversity, inclusion, and equity work. And My City Academy is an effort that began in Nashville, Tennessee, of helping new Americans really recognize some of the public services and public government that takes place from where they live and work, and how they can be integrated into some of those services and understand them greater and give input to create greater engagement on both sides. Community boards and commissions trainings. We have an organization called Nexus here in Minnesota that is a grassroots, relatively urban organization, but we're trying to have that effort come into greater Minnesota to really help with increasing the level of understanding and knowledge that it takes to be on a board or a commission in communities. And so we're trying to have that training take place in greater Minnesota, particularly with our newer audiences. And Innovations Retreats is an effort internally that we're trying to develop that will allow diverse community members and the dominant community members to come together to really look at ways in which they can think creatively about addressing issues that they have in their communities that maybe need a little bit of a different thinking that has a more of a cross-cultural lens to the programming that could occur. I'll stop there and let Kenny add comments about measurable outcomes from South Dakota.
Yes, thank you, Toby. The connection with the Community Connectors program in Minnesota, we were looking for a model to help the group in Huron expand or bring in other leaders in the Community Connectors program in Worthington, Minnesota. Seemed like a good model, so we're communicating and trying to demonstrate that model to the Huron group. Another really neat thing that came from the meetings and interactions from this grant was the Karen population really wanted to focus on their youth. They could see their youth as wanting to brighten their future, build a future for them. So we asked them what did they want to do with the youth, and they wanted to help them become better civic leaders. They wanted them to understand the structures, the American city structures, leadership, the politics of a city. So we got them connected with the 4-H program there in Huron. And another thing to help expand the understanding of their culture is we invited them to dance. Dancing, their traditional dances are very important in that culture. So we invited them to dance at the state fair this past year, and hopefully that will lead to another time of dancing this coming state fair. So we're already working on that. Moving forward, we are looking at potential funder relationships. One of the times we met with them, we talked about organizing that group. They were literally, the little bit of fundraising they were doing as a group, they kept their funds in a shoebox in one of the members' houses because they weren't clear about checking accounts and what it took to establish a checking account. And so one of the leaders in Huron, the city planner, he helped them establish a checking account so they could put their funds that they raise through various hosting meals and that things. So making those connections, just doing some of the very basics and help building that collaboration across the ethnic groups in Huron has been an outcome there. It's been fun to watch and just establish that relationship with that group. They have a rich heritage and a really a fascinating story of coming from persecution in the refugee camps on the border of Burma and Thailand, and coming to America and buying guns and hunting with the white people in Huron. So it's just a fun, fascinating story about, and something that we can learn a lot from, just extension engaging in these populations. So, Toby, if you want to talk a little bit more about the future work here.
So in Minnesota, as I said earlier, lots of ripples from some of the programming that has occurred. So much so that in Minnesota, one of our plans was also to hire a new position to continue to and expand on our diversity, equity, and inclusion work in Minnesota statewide, but in particular to hire someone in the southern part of the state to take on some of the work that has rippled from this effort. And the Uniting Cultures group that Holli mentioned earlier has now written in part of their grant process, has written an extension into that grant and received funding to do some work at the community level with Uniting Cultures group as they look at expanding and sustaining that particular organization that we hope includes, as time goes on, some Latino leadership training that we think is vital for that particular community. And a particular lesson I think is really important is recognizing how really important those relationships are, because it's only through the relationships that have been built that I really believe that there is a readiness now in that particular community of St. James, Minnesota, to trust Extension enough to be able to say, we think that Extension has something to offer, and they're willing to say, yes, we're willing to listen and also to engage with you to determine if the programming that Extension has to offer could actually benefit them on things that they care about in their communities and help advance the issues and ideas that they have. And I think that is something that is occurring. And there's a level of ambiguity that comes with all this, right? And that, for me, is maybe not part of a cultural norm that I have as being real strong, but it's certainly evident in some of the groups that we've been a part of as being open to that ambiguity. And that's where really I think some of the cross-cultural work happens, when we're open to that. Another thing I think that we will continue to see happen in our communities as part of our future work is co-creating new program pathways. That can mean a number of different things, but I think it really is identifying what communities need and being comfortable knowing that maybe our programming doesn't purposely match that, but being open to say, we might have to do some other work for a little bit of time before we actually find a point where some of the programming that we're best at really does find its place or find its way into what the community will need. But initially that might require us to maybe do a little bit of facilitation, maybe being open to really listening for a long period of time before really being able to offer something that has meaning. And I think that's part of that co-creation of a new pathway. I'm going to advance a slide to a couple quotes that I think were really relevant with regard to what we learned and what the experience was like for a couple of participants that were part of the Rural Equity Learning community as part of this effort as well. And you see two quotes from two different participants as we engaged in this process of co-learning and what we hope the future might be for them and the communities as well as for Extension. I'll stop there and see if there's any additional comments from any of the presenters, as well as if there's anything that we need to respond to in the chat.
Well, thanks for the presentation and telling your story about these interactions. One of the questions that I had, and while I ask this, I hope that the participants will, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat there, and we can have a few minutes for a response. But Toby, early in the webinar, you mentioned that you selected some communities, but there had to be sort of this precondition that there was enough cultural capital in the community to be able to, move some of the initiatives forward, et cetera. What was your filter? Were there some communities that you looked at but they just weren't ready? And then how do you sort of bridge that challenge so that maybe those communities could also, you know, start to build what is needed in order to move forward?
Mark, I don't think it was the communities that we were looking at that had to have the a significant level of cultural or social capital. It was the individuals or the organizations that we initially wanted to partner with as part of this grant. And so it was recognizing that they were organizations and they were individual leaders themselves or participants that were doing what I would say is work that was at the grassroots of many of the communities in southern Minnesota. So Julio is a good example where he works for the American Civil Liberties Union, but has a very, very strong connection to many of the communities in southern Minnesota, both personally and professionally. And so he was a great contact for us because he has the social capital in the communities in which we want to continue to invest ourselves in, and he has the cultural capital because of his background, his upbringing with regard to where he grew up. Actually, he grew up in the communities that we're talking about. So he had that both the cultural and the social capital as an individual that we felt was a perfect fit to partner with on this particular grant. And the other individuals that Holly mentioned earlier, both Jose and Bucata, I think also have that same level of cultural and social capital because they are deeply vested in the communities in which they provide work themselves through the efforts that they have, as well as culturally they have the background, the knowledge, the language, the experiences that make them a good fit both for us but also because they have that incredible asset to the communities in which they are already doing work.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. I really appreciate that. Are there any other questions from the participants? I'll wait for just a minute to see if any questions pop in. And for the participants, we really appreciate your feedback. I put up a webinar summary evaluation, so we really appreciate you providing that feedback. So thank you for that. I don't see any indication of typing. Helen says, great work, thank you, enjoy learning from this. Okay, Holly, Kari, Kenny, and Toby, thank you very much for putting on the webinar and working on this important stuff. And so we'll see everybody again on our next webinar, and I wish you a happy holiday.
Thank you, Mark and Rosa.
All right.